The first harvester went down on day 1. The colonial operations team had assumed it was a malfunction. The machine was old, the agricultural district had rough terrain in the eastern section, and equipment failures happened. They logged it, dispatched a maintenance crew, and didn't think much of it until the maintenance crew came back considerably faster than they had left and with an entirely different energy about them. The second harvester went down on day 3. This one was not a malfunction. The damage pattern was unambiguous. Something had hit it from the side with enough force to collapse the main chassis and had then apparently stepped on the wreckage, because the footprint pressed into the soil next to it was 18 inches across and the depth of it suggested a weight that made the maintenance supervisor stand very still for a moment when he measured it. By day 5 the storage facility on the eastern edge of the district had partially collapsed and the first colonial security response team had been deployed. They came back with 2 people in medical and a unanimous recommendation that they needed more people and significantly better equipment before anyone went back out there. The second response team was better equipped. They came back with 3 people in medical and the team lead, a calm and experienced woman who had handled security incidents across 4 colony worlds, describing in a flat and careful voice something that moved faster than anything that Sci should be physically capable of moving and that had covered 40 meters of open ground in the time it took her team to register that it had started moving. That was day 8. By day 11 the colonial administration had exhausted its local options and filed for Galactic Standard Protocol authorization, which arrived in the system overnight and landed in the relevant inboxes at precisely 8 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. Dr. Nate Cole's inbox was one of them. Nate was the colony's wildlife assessment officer, which was a title that sounded more official than the day-to-day reality of the job usually was. Most of his work involved population surveys, habitat documentation, the occasional animal-related complaint from a farming operation that needed mediation between agricultural interests and whatever local species had decided that a particular field was home. He had been on Draven 4 for 3 years and in that time had dealt with exactly nothing that required Galactic Standard Protocol authorization. He read the document at his desk with his coffee going cold next to his keyboard. The Karath. He knew what they were. Anyone who worked in colonial wildlife assessment knew what they were, the way you knew about certain geological formations or weather patterns. Not from personal experience but from the literature. Apex predator. 6 known systems. Never captured alive. Never successfully relocated. The xenobiology file on Karath behavior was substantial and had been built almost entirely from camera data and the accounts of people who had survived being near one, which was a limited sample for reasons that the file noted clinically. Galactic Standard Protocol for a Karath in a populated zone was clear and had been established after a series of incidents across 3 different colony worlds about 40 years ago. Termination order. Authorized response team with appropriate equipment. Situation resolved. The protocol existed because everything else had been tried and documented and the documentation was not encouraging. The termination order was the second attachment in the email. Pre-filled. Waiting for his signature and the signature of the colonial administrator, after which it would go to the authorized response coordinator and the process would begin. Nate read it twice. He set it down on his desk without signing it. He sat for a moment looking at the wall of his office where he kept a large printed map of the colony's surrounding territory with habitat zones marked in different colors. The agricultural district was in the northeast section. He had walked most of that ground personally during his first year on Draven 4. He knew the terrain. He knew what lived there. He thought about the file on Karath behavior. The camera data. The limited survivor accounts. He thought about what the file did not contain, which was any record of anyone ever actually trying anything other than the 2 documented approaches, termination or forced relocation, both of which produced the same result from a different direction. He picked up his field kit from the hook behind his door. He picked up his thermos from the corner of his desk, still mostly full, he had barely started it. He picked up the notebook he used for field observations, the same battered one he had been using for 2 years with the water-damaged cover and the elastic band holding it shut. Then he walked out of his office and down the corridor and out the front door of the Colonial Wildlife Assessment Building into the flat morning light of Draven 4. He turned northeast and started walking toward the agricultural district. Behind him, 20 minutes later, his supervisor Dr. Ray Hooper arrived at the office for the 8:30 team check-in, found Nate's desk empty, found the unsigned termination order sitting in the middle of it, found the field kit hook empty and the thermos gone, and looked at the northeast-facing window for a long moment. Then he said something. The 2 junior staff members at their desks on the other side of the room heard it clearly. They looked at each other. They looked at their screens. They developed a sudden and mutual interest in their morning work that lasted until Ray had walked back into his own office and closed the door. Outside, getting smaller against the flat agricultural landscape, Nate was already halfway to the district boundary with his thermos and his notebook and no particular plan beyond showing up and seeing what was actually there before anyone decided what to do about it. It was, most people would have said, the least sensible decision made in the colony that Tuesday. Most people would have been thinking about it differently than Nate was. Nate heard it before he saw it. Not a sound exactly, more like the absence of sound, spreading outward from a point in the eastern section of the agricultural district the way silence spreads when something that everything else is afraid of is present and everything else has adjusted its behavior accordingly. The bird equivalents in this region of Draven 4 were small and numerous and loud, and they had gone completely quiet in a radius that Nate tracked as he walked, using it as a directional tool the way experienced field researchers learn to use environmental cues. He found the collapsed storage facility first. He stood at the edge of the damage and looked at it for a while without going closer. The structural failure was not gradual. This had come down in one event, one application of force to a load-bearing section that had cascaded through the rest of the building in seconds. The material was heavy-gauge colonial construction, the standard prefab that went up on every colony world because it was cheap and fast and rated for significant stress loads. Something had hit it hard enough and in the right place to bring it down like it was made of something considerably less substantial. He noted this in his field book. Then he looked up and found the Karath. It was 45 meters away, partially in the shadow of the remaining wall section, and it was already looking at him. The file had said massive. Files always said massive when they meant something outside normal scaling. It was an imprecise word that covered a lot of ground. What Nate was looking at was not massive in the way of large animals he had worked around before, the bulk and heaviness of size accumulated for its own sake. It was massive the way certain things are massive when every part of them serves a specific purpose and the purpose is being the most dangerous thing in any environment it occupies. Low to the ground. Longer than it was tall, built horizontally rather than vertically in the way of things designed for speed over open terrain. The coloring was a dark mottled pattern that would have made it extremely difficult to see in broken light or heavy vegetation. In the open shadow of the collapsed wall it was clear and visible and still somehow slightly hard to fully fix on, like the eye kept wanting to slide to the edges of it rather than the center. It was completely still. Looking at him with an attention that was total and unbroken and that Nate recognized from years of field work as the specific quality of attention that an apex predator applies to something it is actively assessing. He looked back at it for a moment. Then he looked at the piece of broken harvester equipment about 5 meters to his left. A flat section of the main chassis that had been thrown clear of whatever had destroyed the machine and had landed at an angle that made one edge approximately seat height. He walked to it. Slowly and without any change in the direction of his body that would read as either approach or retreat. He reached the piece of equipment, turned and sat down on it. He was 40 meters from the Karath. He could feel that distance in a very specific part of his nervous system that had opinions about it. He acknowledged those opinions the same way he always acknowledged the fear response in field work. Noted, present, not in charge. He unclipped his thermos from his kit and poured a lid full of coffee. The Karath had shifted its head orientation when he sat. A small movement, precise, tracking the change in his position and height. It was still looking at him. It had not moved from its position near the wall. Nate drank his coffee and opened his field notebook and started writing. He wrote what he had observed on the walk-in, the silence radius, the direction it spread from, the estimated position of the animal before visual confirmation. He wrote a physical description from his current distance, noting the proportions, the coloring, the specific qualities of how it held its body in rest position. He wrote that it was aware of his presence and had been since approximately 30 seconds after he entered the silence zone, based on the head orientation shift he had caught in peripheral vision. He did not write that he was afraid because that was not field note information, that was personal information, and he kept those categories separate as a professional habit. The Karath watched him write. An hour passed. The sun moved. The shadow from the collapsed wall shifted and the Karath moved with it. Not toward Nate, not away, just repositioning within its own space to maintain the shade. The movement covered maybe 8 meters and it happened in a single fluid motion that lasted about 2 seconds, and that told Nate more about the animal's capability than the entire file back at the office had. He wrote it down. The second hour was quieter than the first. The environmental sounds of the district began to return gradually, small movements in the undergrowth, a few of the bird equivalents resuming their noise at the far edge of the silence radius. Not close, but returning. The ecosystem recalibrating around the presence of the predator the way ecosystems always did when the predator was stationary and not actively hunting. Nate noted this too. The return of ambient sound at specific distances. the threshold at which the other animals determined that non-movement meant non-immediate threat. He cross-referenced it against the silence radius he had tracked coming in. The Karath was still watching him. Not with the fixed locked attention of the first hour. Something had shifted in the quality of it, still aware, still tracking, but the assessment had moved into a different mode. Less immediate. More like the continuous low-level environmental monitoring that any apex predator maintains about everything in its space. The trees, the wind, the ambient sounds, and now this sitting, writing, coffee-drinking human that had arrived, placed itself at 40 meters, and proceeded to do nothing threatening for 2 hours. Prey did not do this. In 300 years of documented Karath behavior, Prey had done many things: fled, frozen, made noise, made no noise, grouped together, scattered. The file was extensive on the variations of the panic response across species. Nothing in the file described prey that sat down. Nothing described prey that stayed. Nate finished his 4th set of field notes at the end of the 4th hour. He checked the time, capped his thermos, closed his notebook, and stood up from the equipment chassis with the careful movement of his ribs and knees after 4 hours on a hard surface. The Karatha's head came up, tracking the change. Nate did not look directly at it. He turned at a slight angle, not away, not toward, the neutral angle that in most animal behavior meant neither challenge nor flight, and began walking back the way he had come. Steady pace. No rushing. He felt the attention on his back for the entire walkout. He did not turn around. He had learned early in field work that turning around was almost always about making yourself feel better and almost never about actual useful information, and he was disciplined about the distinction. He walked back to the district boundary, through the colony's outer streets, and into the wildlife assessment building. He sat at his desk and transferred his field notes to the digital record and wrote a 2-paragraph summary that he filed under Karath, Draven 4, Day 1 observation. In the summary he noted that the animal had not exhibited active predatory behavior during the observation period. That it had demonstrated clear awareness of his presence throughout. That it had made one positional adjustment during the 4 hours and that the adjustment had been environmental rather than behavioral, shade-seeking, not threat response. He noted that it had watched him continuously and that the quality of the attention had shifted over the observation period from active assessment to ambient monitoring. He noted that he would return the following morning. He did not note that sitting 40 meters from the most dangerous animal in 6 known systems for 4 hours on a piece of broken machinery in an empty district had been one of the more remarkable experiences of his professional life. That was personal information. He kept it separate. But it was there. Day 2 Nate arrived at 7 a.m. Same kit. Same thermos. Same notebook with the water-damaged cover. He walked into the agricultural district at the same pace he had walked out of it the evening before, tracking the silence radius the same way, finding the Karath in approximately the same position near the collapsed wall section where he had left it. He sat down at 35 meters. 5 meters closer than yesterday. He had thought about the distance question on the walk-in and had settled on 5 meters per session as the number that made sense. Not because 5 was a round number but because it was small enough that the change session to session would be gradual enough to avoid registering as a significant environmental shift while still producing meaningful cumulative progress over the days he had available. It was the same logic he applied to any behavioral conditioning work. Incremental, patient, below the threshold of what reads as deliberate change. The Karatha's head came up when he settled. The same precise tracking movement as the day before. It looked at him for a long moment with that total and unbroken attention. Then it looked away. Nate wrote that down. He wrote it down carefully and with more detail than the sentence required because it was significant and he wanted the record to reflect that. Yesterday the Karath had maintained active assessment attention for the full 4 hours. This morning it had assessed him, found him consistent with yesterday's data, and returned to ambient monitoring in under 2 minutes. Remembered him. That was the first genuinely important finding and he sat with it while he drank his coffee and the morning light moved across the district. Lisa Grant showed up at the boundary fence at 9 a.m. He had been expecting someone official to appear at some point. The unsigned termination order was not something the colonial administration was going to leave unaddressed indefinitely and he had bought himself some time by leaving a brief message with Ray the previous evening explaining that he was conducting a behavioral assessment and requesting a short hold on the protocol authorization. Ray had apparently forwarded something to someone because here was the security chief, standing at the fence line with her arms folded and binoculars around her neck, watching him sit 35 meters from a Karath and drink coffee. He gave her a small wave. She did not wave back. She lifted the binoculars and looked at the Karath for a long time and then looked at him and then looked at the Karath again. He turned back to his field notes. Day 3 he came in at 30 meters. The Karath tracked him on arrival, assessed for 90 seconds, returned to ambient monitoring. He wrote it down. Lisa was at the fence by 8:45. Day 4 he came in at 25 meters. He had been watching the Karatha's behavior across the first 3 sessions and had noticed something that was not in the file. A pattern to its resting periods, a preference for specific orientations relative to the sun, a particular way it held its head when the wind changed direction that was different from the way it held its head when it was tracking something. He was building a behavioral map. The file had data points. He was developing something more like an understanding. At 25 meters the ambient sounds of the district returned faster than they had on previous days. He noted that too. The other animals were recalibrating to his presence as well, not just the Karathas but his specifically. A stationary non-threatening input that arrived at the same time each morning and sat quietly and left. He was becoming part of the district's environmental baseline. Lisa had brought a folding chair by day 4. She set it up at the fence line and sat in it with her binoculars and her security radio and the expression of a woman who had completely run out of the professional vocabulary to describe what she was observing and was managing this by watching very carefully and saying very little. They had exchanged exactly 11 words across 4 days. He had said good morning on day 2. She had said don't get killed. He had said I'll do my best. She had made a sound that was not quite a response and lifted her binoculars. Day 5 Nate came in at 15 meters. He felt the difference immediately. Not because anything about the situation had become less serious. 15 meters from a Karath was 15 meters from a Karath regardless of how many days of prior observation you had accumulated. But because something in the quality of the morning had shifted. The silence radius when he arrived was smaller than it had been on day 1. The ambient sounds returned within 10 minutes of him sitting down. The ecosystem of the district had incorporated his morning presence into its normal operating picture. The Karath was resting in its preferred morning position. He had mapped this now, the specific spot it used in the early hours before the sun cleared the wall remnants. It tracked his arrival. Assessed. Returned to rest. And then, this was new, this was the thing he wrote 3 careful paragraphs about in his field notes. It did something he had not seen in the previous 4 sessions. It shifted its resting position. Not away from him. Slightly toward, angling its body so that he was within its forward sight line without any active head movement required. Passive monitoring. The adjustment you make when something has moved from the active assessment category to the environmental awareness category. It had filed him. Not as prey. Not as threat. As a consistent and predictable element of the morning environment that did not require active tracking resources because it had demonstrated sufficient consistency to be managed passively. He sat at 15 meters and wrote field notes for 4 hours and the Karath rested and the district's birds and small creatures went about their business around both of them and the morning passed like any other morning. At the fence line Lisa Grant wrote in her daily security report with the careful handwriting of someone choosing each word deliberately. She had been security chief for 9 years across 2 colony worlds. She had written hundreds of reports. She had a solid professional vocabulary for complex situations and she was good at finding the right framing for things that didn't fit standard categories. Under current status of Karath situation she wrote, Animal remains in agricultural district. No new damage reported since day 1 of assessment protocol. Wildlife assessment officer conducting daily proximity sessions. Distance reduced to 15 meters. Animal showing no active threat behavior toward officer. She stopped. Read it back. Under threat level assessment she wrote, unclear. She stopped again. Under recommended action she sat for a long time. Then she wrote, wait. She looked at what she had written. It was the shortest recommended action she had ever filed in 9 years. It was also, she thought, the most honest thing she could put in the box given what she was actually observing. She filed it and put her radio back on her belt and looked out at the agricultural district where Nate was packing up his kit at the end of the session. The Karath watched him stand and go through the process of capping his thermos and closing his notebook with the passive environmental awareness it now apparently assigned to him. Like the trees. Like the wind. Lisa watched all of it through her binoculars and thought about the termination order sitting and signed on a desk in the Wildlife Assessment Building and thought about 9 years of security work and thought about what she was going to write in tomorrow's report. She folded up her chair. She came back the next morning anyway. Nate had been thinking about the 7th morning since day 5. Not planning it exactly, he was too experienced in field work to mistake planning for preparation when it came to animal behavior. Plans assumed a fixed outcome and animal behavior did not offer fixed outcomes. What he had been doing was closer to readiness. Building an internal picture of what the conditions would need to look like before the next step was reasonable, what signals he would need to see from the Karath across days 6 and 7 before he adjusted the approach, what his own internal state would need to be. Day 6 confirmed what he needed it to confirm. Nate sat at 10 meters for the full session, and the Karatha's passive monitoring never escalated to active assessment. Not once across 4 hours. He was environmental. He was furniture. He was the morning human that arrived and sat and left and was not a variable worth redirecting resources toward. He wrote his day 6 notes that evening and sat with them for a long time. Then he went to bed early because he wanted to be rested, and he had learned over years of field work that the quality of your attention in a high-stakes situation was directly connected to how rested you were going into it, and he was not going to compromise that. Day 7. He arrived at his usual time. Lisa was already at her position when he came through the district boundary. She had been arriving earlier each day. He had noticed the progression without commenting on it. Day 1 she had arrived at 9 a.m. By day 6 she was there before him. Today she was set up 200 meters out with the good binoculars, the ones with the extended range that she had brought from the security office, and she had the recording unit running on the tripod beside her chair. She had started recording on day 5 without telling him. He had noticed the equipment on day 6 and not said anything. He appreciated the record. He walked to his position and sat down. 10 meters from the Karath. The animal tracked his arrival in the now familiar way: passive sweep, brief elevation of head orientation, return to rest. The morning sounds of the district were already present when he arrived. The baseline had normalized completely. He was not an event anymore. He was just part of the morning. He drank half his thermos slowly over the first 2 hours. He made field notes about the Karatha's morning behavior, the specific sequence of it, the resting period, the single positional adjustment it made when the sun cleared the wall at approximately 8:40 every morning, the way it breathed in deep rest versus the slightly shallower pattern of ambient monitoring rest. He knew this animal's rhythms now in the way you knew them after 7 mornings of careful and total attention. He knew what attack still looked like. He knew what alert still looked like. He knew the difference between the head position it used when it was tracking something in the middle distance and the one it used when it was tracking something nearby. He knew the ear orientation, the structures above and behind the primary visual sensors that moved independently, that preceded a shift from passive to active assessment. He had built the map he needed. At the end of the second hour he capped his thermos and set it down beside his kit. Then he stood up. Slowly. The kind of slowly that is almost not movement at all. The kind that requires a specific muscular discipline to maintain because the body's natural standing motion is faster than what the situation required, and he had to actively work against that. He had practiced it the previous evening in his quarters, feeling slightly ridiculous, knowing it mattered. The Karatha's ears moved. A small adjustment, registering the change. Nate stood at his full height and did not move for 5 full minutes. Letting the new variable, his standing position, become familiar. Letting the Karatha's assessment process run and conclude. The ears settled back. The head orientation did not change. Ambient monitoring same as before. He took 1 step forward. 1 step. Then 5 minutes of stillness. Then another step. The approach was not a walk. It barely qualified as movement by conventional definition. It was the outermost edge of motion, the minimum change per unit of time that still constituted closing distance. Between each step he stood completely still and breathed slowly and monitored every visible signal the Karath was producing. The ears were his primary instrument. They were more honest than the head orientation and more immediate than the body posture. They moved faster and they moved first. Every step he took he watched the ears. The moment they shifted toward the active tracking position he would stop and hold until they settled, and then he would wait longer before the next step. The whole thing was a conversation conducted entirely in stillness and incremental movement. 5 meters took 15 minutes. He was at 5 meters and he could hear the animal breathing. That was new. Close enough to hear the specific sound of it. The deep, slow respiratory rhythm of large-bodied rest. The slight variation when the ears moved and the monitoring level shifted. He had read about Karath respiratory patterns in the file. Reading about them and standing 5 meters away listening to them were experiences with essentially nothing in common. He stood at 5 meters for 10 minutes. The ears held steady. He took the last steps slowly, one at a time. The final meter took 8 minutes by itself because he was moving in increments that he could barely feel himself making and monitoring every signal simultaneously, and his own heart rate had opinions about the proximity that he was managing with the same deliberate attention he had been applying to everything else for 7 days. Then he was there. He raised his right hand slowly, the same quality of movement he had been using for the entire approach, below the threshold, gradual, and extended it the remaining distance. He placed his palm flat against the Karatha's flank. The animal went still. Not the stillness he had learned to read as pre-strike, that had a tension to it, a loaded quality, the coiled preparation of something about to move very fast. This was different. This was the stillness of a system that has received an input so far outside any existing category that it has redirected everything to processing it. Every visible signal went to neutral simultaneously. The breathing paused for one beat. The ears went to a position he had never seen before, not tracking, not resting, something in between that his field notes had no notation for yet. The Karatha's skin was warm under his palm. He registered that with the part of his brain that was still observing and recording because that part never fully stopped. Warm, and the surface of it had a texture he hadn't expected. Not smooth, not rough, something in between with a slight directional quality to it. He kept his hands still and kept his own breathing slow and counted. 1, 2, 3. At 30 the Karatha exhaled. It was long and slow and released all at once. Not the regular rhythm of its resting breath, but something deeper and more complete than that. The kind of exhale that comes when something the body has been holding releases at once because the assessment that required the holding has reached its conclusion. The conclusion was not a threat. Nate kept his hand where it was and let his own breath out slowly. 200 meters away, Lisa Grant had been watching through the good binoculars with the recording unit running since Nate stood up from his kit position. She had watched the approach in real time. She was a security professional with significant field experience, and she had assessed risk for a living for 9 years, and she had understood clearly at the 5-meter mark that what she was watching was either going to be the most significant wildlife assessment event in colonial history or something that she would have to file a very different kind of report about. She watched his hand make contact. She watched the stillness. She watched the exhale. And then something happened to her legs that she would later describe to her deputy as the structural equivalent of a long-held breath releasing. They simply stopped doing their job in the way they had been doing it, and she sat down in the grass of the agricultural district boundary in her security chief uniform with her binoculars in her hands and watched the rest of it from there. Nate stood at the Karatha's flank with his hand on its side for another 4 minutes. He did not move. He did not push for more than the moment offered. He had gotten what he came for, and he was experienced enough to know that the correct response to getting what you came for was not to immediately want more. Then he lowered his hand slowly, stepped back in the same incremental way he had approached, and began the walk back to his kit. He picked up his thermos. He picked up his notebook. He wrote one sentence in the field notes. Contact made. No threat response. Assessment complete. Then he sat down and added 4 more paragraphs because one sentence was not adequate, and he knew it, and he had a professional obligation to the record regardless of how his hands were doing right now. They were not entirely steady. He noted that too. Personal information, but accurate. The morning after the touch, Nate went back to the agricultural district at his usual time. He did not know what he was going to find. That was the honest answer to the question he could see forming in Lisa's expression when he passed her at the boundary fence. He did not know if the previous morning had been a singular moment or the beginning of something with a different shape. He knew what he had observed. He knew what the exhale meant physiologically. He knew that the Karath had not moved against him at the closest proximity any documented human or otherwise had ever voluntarily maintained with one. What that meant for the morning after was a question the data did not yet answer. He found the Karath in its usual resting position. It tracked his arrival the same way it had been tracking his arrivals for a week. Passive sweep, brief head orientation, return to rest. He sat at 10 meters and drank his coffee and wrote his field notes, and the morning passed like the previous 7 mornings had passed. Except it wasn't the same. And he knew it wasn't the same even if nothing visible had changed. Something had moved across a threshold the previous morning, and thresholds, in his experience, did not uncross themselves. He was right about that. The first visible change came on day 9. Nate arrived to find the Karath not in its usual position near the collapsed wall but closer to his regular sitting spot. Not dramatically closer, maybe 8 meters closer than usual, but the repositioning was deliberate in the way that all its movements were deliberate. It had moved toward the place it associated with him. He sat down and did not make a thing of it and wrote 3 careful paragraphs in his field notes about what the repositioning indicated and what it did not yet indicate and where the distinction mattered. The destruction stopped completely by day 10. It had been tapering since day 4. He had noted the absence of new damage reports in his daily log but had not wanted to assign causation before he had more data. By day 10 it was clear enough to state directly. The Karath was still in the agricultural district. It was moving through it, using it, existing in it as an apex predator exists in its territory. But the machinery, the structures, the equipment at the district's edges, none of it was being damaged. The behavioral assessment Nate filed on day 10 was 42 pages long. The summary section at the front was 3 paragraphs. The core finding was that the Karatha's destructive behavior in the district had not been aggression in the conventional sense. It had been the response of a territorial animal to perceived threat stimuli from the machinery and activity of the agricultural operation. Remove the threat response trigger and the destructive behavior ceased because the destructive behavior had never been the point. The point had been the threat response and the machinery had looked like threat. He recommended immediate halt of all heavy equipment operation within the eastern boundary section and the establishment of a formal protected habitat zone along the district's outer edge. He recommended a new operational protocol for agricultural activity in the district that routed harvester paths away from the Karatha's primary territorial range. He attached 7 days of behavioral data, the full recording from Lisa's equipment on day 7, and his own field notes from all 9 sessions. He did not recommend termination. The termination order was still on his desk, still unsigned. He filed it away in the physical records drawer and did not bring it back out. The report went up the chain and kept going. Ray forwarded it to the Colonial Administration with a cover note that was 2 sentences long and that communicated, in the careful language of a man who was still processing what his junior officer had done, that the situation had developed in a manner that fell outside standard protocol parameters and that the attached report warranted senior review. Senior review escalated it. Within 3 weeks the report had reached the Galactic Xenobiology Board, accompanied by Lisa's footage, which had been reviewed internally by the Colonial Security Office and then released to the scientific community because there was genuinely no precedent for what it showed and precedent-setting footage belonged in the hands of people equipped to understand it. The Galactic Xenobiology Board watched the footage of the touch in a formal session. Then they watched it again. Then they apparently spent a significant amount of time not saying very much and looking at each other, because the meeting notes from that session were unusually sparse for a board that was known for extensive documentation, and the sparse notes continued across 3 follow-up sessions spanning several months. The board's formal response came eventually. It was thorough and carefully worded and cited 17 existing research papers and acknowledged the need for significant revision to 4 of them. It recommended the establishment of a new research classification for Karath behavioral assessment. It noted, in language that was restrained in the way that scientific language is restrained when the people writing it are still slightly stunned, that the footage represented the first documented case of successful voluntary proximity initiation between a human and a Karath and that the methodology employed by Dr. Cole warranted detailed study. 3 separate research institutions contacted the colony within the first month requesting access to the district for observation purposes. Nate responded to each of them with the same polite and detailed message explaining the conditions under which observation could occur without disrupting the behavioral baseline that had been established, the distances that were safe and would remain safe, and the specific activities that were not permitted in the district under any circumstances including the research context. He was protective of the baseline. He had built it carefully over 9 mornings and he was not going to let it get dismantled by well-meaning researchers who hadn't done the preceding work. Lisa updated the Colonial Security Force's Karath protocol on a Tuesday afternoon about 3 weeks after day 7. She did it herself rather than delegating it because she felt she owed the situation that much personal attention. She pulled up the standard Galactic Protocol document, the termination order framework, the response team specifications, the equipment requirements, and she read through it one more time. Then she created a new document. 1 page. Clear language. At the top she wrote, Karath Incident Response Protocol, Draven 4 Colonial Security Force, revised. The body of the document was 4 paragraphs covering observation procedures, safe distance maintenance, communication with the Wildlife Assessment Office, and civilian guidance for district-adjacent areas. Where the termination authorization section had been, she wrote a single line. Contact Dr. Cole first. She filed it in the system, archived the old version, and sent a copy to Ray's office and to the Colonial Administrator and to the Galactic Standard Protocol Registry as a formal revision submission. The submission was accepted 6 weeks later after review. The note on the acceptance said that it was the first successful revision to the Karath Standard Protocol in 40 years. The Karath was seen near Nate's field station for the first time on day 14. He arrived in the morning to find it resting at the edge of the cleared area around the station, about 30 meters from the building, in the specific resting orientation he had mapped in the first week. He stood at his door for a moment looking at it. It looked at him with its passive environmental monitoring attention. He went inside and got his thermos and his notebook and came back out and sat on the step and drank his coffee and wrote his field notes. He started leaving water out on day 15. A large flat basin, the kind used for equipment cooling, filled each morning. He did not position it close to the station. He put it at the edge of the cleared area where the Karatha's morning presence seemed to anchor. He did not make a production of it. He filled it and went about his work. By day 20 the Karath was coming to the water in the mornings while he was visible. Not close. Not in the way of something that had become tame. He was careful about that word and had refused it in 3 separate interview requests from journalists who had picked up the story from the Xenobiology Board's public communications. Tame was not the right word, and he said so clearly every time. The Karath was not tame. It was exactly what it had always been. What had changed was not the animal. What had changed was the quality of information it had been given to work with. People asked him how he had known it would work. The question came in interviews, in the board's formal inquiry, in conversations with the research teams who came through, in messages from wildlife assessment officers on other colony worlds who had read the report. Everyone asked some version of the same thing. How did you know? He told them the same thing every time. He hadn't known. He had looked at the termination order and looked at the file and thought about the gap between what the file documented and what it would mean to actually understand something rather than just respond to it. He had thought that the Karath had been making decisions based on the information available to it and that nobody had ever tried changing the information. He had thought it deserved the chance to be understood before anyone decided what it was. Most people received that answer and did not quite know what to do with it. They had been expecting something about technique or methodology or the specific behavioral indicators that had told him the approach was viable. Those things were in the report and they were real and they mattered. But they weren't the answer to the question that had actually been asked. The people who understood the actual answer were usually quiet for a while after he gave it. Not because it was complicated. Because it wasn't. Because it was the kind of simple that takes a moment to settle into properly. He kept writing field notes. He kept filling the water basin. He kept going to the agricultural district on the mornings when his schedule allowed and sitting at what had become his usual spot and watching the Karath move through its territory with the same careful and total attention he had brought to the first morning. The file on Karath behavior kept growing. He was the one adding to it now. He thought that was the most useful thing he had done in 3 years on Draven 4, and he was probably right.